So it's a real delight to be opening the second seminar, which I'll be chairing today. Jenny Danoop, I think, is online, who will be answering any questions or bringing any questions to our attention with any luck. I'm just going to say before we begin, just so we can have some sense of continuity between the seminars, my name is Havsteen-Franklin. I'm a consultant in art therapies and a professor of practice at Brunel University. This is the second seminar, and I wanted to provide some sense of continuity to what we're doing here and how this kind of makes sense in terms of today's world and what's happening in art therapies. So first of all, just to say thank you so much to Senna, who's here today, Senna Saar, who's helping us to coordinate the program, and Jenny Danoop, who's online, who's been really behind the scenes, making sure it all comes together. I also want to thank CNWL NHS Foundation Trust for hosting some of these events, and Brunel University have kindly funded the seminar series. So many thanks to Brunel University. And just to say, this comes under a new research group that I'll be chairing, which is Arts, Health and Social Change. So you'll be seeing much more about the activities within that research group. We're hoping it'll have international impact, and various different projects will be emerging from that space. So I welcome input into that, collaborations and so forth. So onwards and upwards. So I want to talk a little bit, because we have today artists, art therapists, researchers, practitioners of all sorts, engaging with complex relations of ourselves and the world. And we're doing this through arts principally. And we're kind of, at the moment, we're faced with a significant challenge, a kind of formidable task, if you like, of addressing some of the big inequalities, climate change and so forth. And so I really wanted this seminar series to kind of address some of those bigger issues, longer term issues, with the small steps we can make in our practices. So we know that our actions as practitioners have profound implications, but many of these we don't see immediately. We don't see the immediate impact. Sometimes it's quite imperceptible, particularly in terms of some of the bigger issues. So in fact, that we've found ourselves, the kind of species, facing some of these kind of troubles and difficulties is because of this imperceptible change. We don't notice it day to day, but of course over decades, we really do see the impact. So our actions as a species have profound consequences. So how do we become more conscious of the impact of our actions? And what does this mean in a therapeutic context? So for example, I was amazed to see that we are accountable for the loss of around about 70% of wildlife in the last 50 years. So there's been a reduction of wildlife, which is just incredible when we think about it. So we can see the kind of impacts we're having in a kind of negative way. So we live in a time when we're kind of moving now between these different scales of perception, the kind of global perspective, right down to the kind of community, sort of local perspective. The problem with this kind of alternation of perspectives is it's really hard to know what our responsibility is. What impact we can have as individuals when we look at this kind of global, and I say this like global because we tend to either think of it as something that's sort of like a beach ball about this sort of size, feels quite manageable to me, or we see ourselves as kind of relatively tiny member of many, which all become very uniform. So it's really hard for us to conceptualize and be with a sense of globalness. Yeah. So then what impact can we have? And what responsibility can we have? So this is using Donna Haraway's concept of responsibility, where we feel enabled to be responsible. So more recently, our sort of geopolitical world crises have brought to bear a complex relationship between the intimate and local and global perspective. So we leap between scales. In those moments, we might forget our own responsibility. So can we reduce, how do we think about ourselves within this context? So we can talk and theorize, we can explore the problems of the ontological, the epistemological divide, but new knowledges develop through action. In the worlds of arts-based practitioners, it's arguable that being in contact with the improvised dialogic qualities of things that bring novel awareness to ecologies helps to see oneself as a shifting, mobile ephemera within an ecological composition, or to use Deleuze, the philosopher, and Guattari term, an assemblage of what matters. So highly complex, multi-level, interactive situations, all in relation to one another. So we're looking at a complex scenario. The problem is, of course, we've seen the privileging of thought, of verbal language, of a kind of higher consciousness over recent decades, which really obviously deprivileges a kind of more arts-based, matter-based kind of dialogue. So we saw this very much in the last seminar about how people really brought to the forefront how we begin to engage with the corporality, the matters, what does matter, the materiality of art therapies. So it's not, so thinking about how this relates to what is being marginalized, and again, this was a big theme in the last seminar, it's not always comfortable. In fact, it probably should be discomforting, engaging with what matters. It's an unfamiliar territory for most of us in the West. It threatens to shift, challenge, reassemble the boundaries between human and non-human. So this is John Comfra, who I haven't got here, but I'm going to tell you a bit about him. So he's a Ghana-born British artist who deals with just these kinds of sort of issues through this kind of juxtaposition of different critical spaces, sort of globally, to try and make sense of what happens in the kind of gaps, if you like, or the ways in which we compose a new kind of reference for globalism, we could say. So this is a quote from him. "You need to hang on to the idea of a renewed, effective economy in which things and beings renew their relationship with each other. That is very much part of the impetus behind Vertigo C." This is a still from the Venice Biennale last year, where he had 3 films playing from different locations in the world. So he's also a filmmaker. But I think the third thing that I would throw in is the idea of proximity, of bringing that which have no necessary correspondence with each other to see whether in forcing them into a dialogue with one another, you can renew language itself or narrative itself. So in a sense, creating new assemblages, proximities, relations that follow out from the last seminar, decentres anthropocentrism. So assemblage eloquently places a perspective within a togetherness, and I can see my camera wandering, it's not me, places a perspective within a togetherness that transcends the individual. In other words, nature is so deeply entangled with culture, many theorists have said they should be one word, sort of nature culture. So Barrett developed the idea of agential realism, but she argues, what if it is only in facing the inhuman, the indeterminate non-being, non-becoming of mattering and not mattering, that an ethics committed to the rupture of indifference can arise? What if it is only in the encounter with the inhuman, the liminality of no-thingness? And she purposely uses these slashes so they don't have, they bring together a dichotomy. In all its liveliness is conditions of impossibility that we can truly confront our inhumanity, that is, our actions lacking compassion. So this applies, of course, to all of us. So next, moving to the next slide. And so this is Rosie Bradotti's, the cover of her book, The Posthuman. This is a kind of important statement, the redesigning of Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. And this is a common theme with many sort of contemporary theorists in new materialism, posthumanism, just that we're looking at including different kinds of dimensions. So we're constantly, it's really a statement about being constantly involved in a dynamic corporality that is now responding to our unconscious damage in the form of climate warming and social inequalities caused by poor distribution of the things that matter, partly. The question is, do we dare to be touched by the unfamiliar, the unknown, what might feel alien, that of which we are made up of as much as that which we call nature? This perhaps is where arts are most important, as within our verbal domains, we are caught in trappings of preconceived ideas structured through the data of the prism of Western rational thought. So arts feel their way beyond these preconceptions and open new possibilities of discourses that are revealed not through a particular quality of reflective and representational cognition, but through tangible being within, in, and of the assemblage of materiality. in this way, we can begin to learn from people who do not enact privileging a verbal language, but have lived with assemblages and marginalized knowledges about being with and in what matters. So this is Sophia Farhart. So this is this process also extends our awareness, care, love, and appreciation for all that matters. So this is created by Sophia Farhart, who was a very influential Tunisian artist who really changed the perceptions of who women are and what they can be within the Tunisian society by setting up art institutions, but really building on this kind of arts-based discourse where sewing, weaving, and the arts more generally were promoted as a serious method of communication within the social world. And this is one of her pieces, and often she collaborated with many women and many artists. So you can just see that it becomes a beautiful assemblage, a tapestry. It's a collection of complex elements. So I'm going to just stop in a moment, I promise you, but I want to say what we're going to hear about today is how we begin to rethink how arts can be resituated from a kind of collective perspective in a very practice-based way. So I've given some of the theoretical background just as a thread through this seminar series about what it really means to be engaging in these types of arts-based practices, which are quite new in many ways in terms of the field, within the field of psychological therapies, of course relate so deeply to some of the indigenous knowledges and practices that are much more craft-based and culturally nuanced, let's say. So we can think more widely and broadly about what health change happens in that space and how that can happen through social change, community change, and how this really is a sort of deep kind of discourse that often happens in a very non-verbal kind of way. So I'm going to hand you over now to Diane and Katie, who are our first presenters. So let me just
introduce ourselves.
No, I can. So Diane Eagles is somebody who's been a real sort of guide for me in my clinical work in CNWL. Still very much informs my clinical practice. Is a senior art psychotherapist, head of art therapies for older people services. Is that right? That's right. Still, it's been you've been in the service for I think more than 20 years.
28, yeah.
28 years. Wow, that's quite some time, huh?
It's a long time.
So probably the oldest serving member of the art therapies within CNWL.
Not
yeah.
far, yeah.
So one of the long-standing members and one of the most senior. And Katie, who's been working very closely with Diane.
Yes.
You're an artist, you're a support worker, you have a lived experience, right?
Yes.
So you have this multi-dimensional kind of world. When you both came together, you've done something quite amazing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm going to just hand it over to you now, because I think it's really amazing. I've already heard a bit about it, so I'm really interested and amazed by the work you've been doing. So if you can take it over from here, thank you very much.
Oh, that's very lovely. Thank you, Dominic. I think it is quite amazing. I'm quite amazed by what we managed to do in quite a short space of time. But as you mentioned, we are building on a number of projects that have happened before. What's interesting for us, it's one of the first projects that has been written up, if you like, and presented within CNWL. And I know I'm probably doing a disservice to some other art therapists within CNWL who have been trying to engage environmentally and move their practice outside. But I'm going to talk through the slides. So the talk's going to be an overview of the setting up of the project, including a brief outline about environmental art therapy, what it is, for those of you who don't know, not familiar with it. We'll talk about how we implemented environmental art therapy for the NHS setting in which we work, which is CNWL. And we'll give a fleeting look at each of the 6 sessions from the project so that you can see some of the creative works, although we don't go into the content of the artwork in any great detail. We will focus, though, on the qualitative material, in particular the findings from the feedback questions on the project, and some reflections and thoughts about the findings in the project as a whole. We'll then end with an introduction to some theoretical concepts, although Dominic's touched on quite a lot of those in his introduction. But I'll give a brief overview of the ones that I think are quite important for people to know about if you don't already. And then we'll open up for some questions and discussion. Okay. Could we have a next slide, please? So Dominic's kindly introduced Katie and myself, but I also want to say a huge thank you to the people who came to the group, and that's Iman, Bob and Claudia. And they've given consent very kindly for all of their contributions to be used, the photographs of the artwork, photographs that were taken within the environment, which you'll see throughout the presentation, and their comments and feedback. So environmental art therapy can be fully immersive sensory experience, working within an environment and using elements found within it. It has overlaps with sculpture, movement, performance and sound. Evidence shows that engaging in the environment is helpful for the reduction of anxiety, depression and stress-related symptoms. It helps emotional regulation through increasing the production of cortisol, which supports our capacity to relax and be calm and lowers blood pressure. Environmental art therapy offers an increase in general mental well-being, satisfaction and quality of life. It improves self-esteem and confidence. Additionally, it can benefit attention and cognition through active looking. In a group format, it increases social contact, inclusion and a sense of belonging. Little artistic skill is needed for ecological art therapy. The materials are readily available and can be invested with meaning and significance through projective metaphor. The format has a low environmental impact. There's greater democracy in the outdoors. Clients can lead and determine the use of space and the choice of materials. Ecological art therapy promotes a sense of valuing and taking care of the environment, encouraging living more sustainably in the world. Next slide, please. So whilst, okay, I should have had that one on before, I beg your pardon. So yeah, it's just a brief overview of environmental art therapy. It does go through by the title of other names, so you might see it as arts therapy in green spaces. And there are forms of psychotherapy without the arts in green spaces. And that gives a rough definition of the therapeutic use of natural materials, locations, themes and cycles. Some of the founders of environmental art therapy reference the turning year, its seasons and traditions. But at the heart is the relationship between the self, the feeling self and the natural world. Thank you. So whilst the project was being set up, I attended an environmental art therapy training in Highgate Woods, which is run by Gary Nash and Vanessa Jones. And it's a 4-week introductory workshop over 4 months to enable art psychotherapy clinical practitioners to move their practice out of doors. And I should point out that Katie very kindly took on the project, not knowing entirely what he was entering into, coming from an artist perspective, but not an environmental art therapy perspective. Next slide. Okay, so this is a slide showing a very brief overview of the project and the flyer that we put together. So it followed on from some of the environmental art therapy sessions that we'd started to implement within CNWL, and I'd run a couple on staff away days. And I was quite interested to see if we could take environmental art therapy further. And I wanted to trial this type of engagement with a small cohort of community patients who were experiencing depression and or anxiety. So the idea was to set up some sessions at Holland Park Ecology Centre, which is down in Kensington and Chelsea. And it's where we'd run some of the previous environmental art therapy activities. So I knew it to be quite a safe and supportive environment, and it has a range of spaces for working in during any weather. So the pilot proposal was for 6 2.5-hour sessions to be held weekly at the Ecology Centre. The sessions would be non-directed, using only a few materials to support the making in the woodland: natural twine, clay, scissors, chalk and charcoal. and a few directive themes were given to focus the sessions: an early memory of a green space, a natural object from home, change, and ending. Group members were supported to be in the environment, to follow their feelings and focus on their senses. Participants would be required to provide qualitative data on their experience and to give consent for this and images of their work to be used in the project write-up. We were fortunate to get a CNWL grant and some funding to secure payment for the venue hire of Holland Park Ecology Centre, and some of the initial funding also paid for a bit of Katie's time to the project implementation plan. So we then started to look for 6 referrals from a range of sources within the borough's secondary and primary care services, through community mental health teams, community health services such as Mind. And we had 6 referrals, 1 from the local CMHT and 5 from Community Living Well. 3 people from the Community Living Well service formed the group, and we started the sessions uncertain who would attend, but people were contacted by email, phone, text message, and encouraged to join. 2 people said that they would join, but they never arrived at the session, and it remains uncertain why this was, although a number of attempts were made to find out.
Okay. Hello everyone, nice to be here. My name is Katie Stone, I'm a service user representative. I have a great interest in fine art and I've been very excited in this outdoor project. I got involved with the EAT project through CNWL NHS Foundation Trust in January 2023. I became a facilitator working with Diane to run the group for 6 weeks in the summer. The sessions were running Monday afternoons from 5th of June to the 10th of July. The first session, Diane and myself were preparing together. Although we were expecting participants to attend the Ecology Centre, no one showed up. The Ecology Centre is a welcoming community space that encourages younger people to connect with nature. At first, I was not sure what to expect. My role was to explain the aims of the course and talk about my feelings and senses. Diane spoke a little bit about our safety and the outside environment, being careful about touching holly leaves and the bad weather. The sun was out most of the time.
I just want to point out that there's this is very near the Ecology Centre, but it's only the image on the right that's actually in the little woodland space that we used. So, but the others just give an essence of Holland Park itself.
So yeah, the Ecology Centre is a private woodland indoor centre space, refreshment area, toilets, and supported by staff on site. Next slide.
Okay, so when Katie and I were discussing it, we put together a rough timetable that we
There we are.
meet. Oh, there we go.
So here's the session timetable. At 1:45 to 2, me and Diane set up. At 2 to 2:30, we check the mood stones. And then at 2:30, 3:30, we went into the woodland. At 3:30, we were back in the centre for a break. And then at 4 o'clock, we had team reflections on our mood stones. At 4:45, Diane and I finished.
We'll mention a bit about the mood stones later on.
Yeah. Session 1, next slide.
Okay. It's got a bit missing, I think.
Oh, okay. So session 1 began with writing words on stones that came to mind about how we were feeling. I wrote down excited, I don't know if you can see it there, and Diane wrote anticipating. There we are. In the woodland, I created a piece that reminded me of my dad, who is a mechanic. The charcoal on the leaves and getting dirty brought memories of him in a garage. Diane came up with a pair of shin pads, and when we got back to the centre to talk about how we felt, I came up with the word satisfied, and Diane was content.
I think what was interesting for me, that unfortunately we didn't have people attending on session 1, but it was really useful for Katie and myself to spend a bit of time going through the format and spending time in the woodland and just seeing how that worked. But the next session, we did have Bob and Iman with us, and we still went through the same format, The only difference on that day was, apart from having the participants with us, is that it was there was electric storms going on, so we were quite anxious about working outside. It was the height of the summer, it was very hot, very humid, and it did make quite an electric atmosphere. And what was very lovely for us was that the support staff from the Ecology Centre actually gave us coats to wear in case we got drenched, so it was very nice having that support and knowing that we could work in the woodland, but equally we could go back into the Ecology Centre, which is indoors, so it gave us a choice.
So in the third session, we all brought something from home. I brought a ceramic pot that represented my grandmother and the connection I had with her at home. Bob brought a wind chimer that had the thoughts of travel. Diane brought some clay that suggested materials that we didn't have in the space that brought changeability. Iman was not here, so she sent her apologies.
What was interesting for me was Iman being absent. She had a planned absence, she was moving, and it brought in something about the the theme of change. Although I'd been thinking about having that as a project title, it made it much more alive for us within the setting as well. And it picks up very nicely something about working within an environmental session, within an environmental context rather, thinking about change, letting go, growth and uncertainty. So there's lots of themes that can be picked up on there.
So session 5 felt like the coming of an end to the project. Claudia joins us, bringing us a different energy. In the woodland, she created something that looked like a totem pole. With Bob, it was animal pieces, and Diane's work showed curiosity with her shrine piece. At this stage, there was more comments, connections, and reflecting on each other's work.
Yeah, I should have mentioned when I did my session 4 that we'd had notification that Claudia was going to join us. So although she was late to the sessions, she fitted in really well, and she joined us in session 6 as well. And like as Katie says, it brought a very different energy with her. And I think by the time we got to session 6, it almost felt like we were just starting, although that was our end session. That we'd managed to form a group, people were becoming comfortable working in the environment. I see a change in in the richness of the artwork and the art making, and we'll come back to some of that when we talk about the feedback. So we're going to go on to talk through the feedback, and we've put it all on the slides, so it does look quite heavy as slides. So what we've done is we've highlighted some of the key words that Katie and I are going to talk through. Okay, so the feedback questions that we gave out. We gave these out the week after the project had finished, so to try and capture what was still on people's minds. How do you feel the environmental art therapy affected your mental health or well-being? Can you say something about what you got creatively from the sessions? Can you say something about how you found being with the environmental art therapy group members? Can you tell us how the environmental art therapy sessions might have changed your relationship with the environment? Was there anything about the sessions which you felt could have been better? And is there anything else about the sessions that you wish to share? We also were thinking of getting some data from a weekly measure, but I wasn't keen to implement a mental health measure. So we came up with the idea of using feeling stone. That's the next slide.
Okay, so the feeling stones, it was a way to mark the start of the session, focusing on how we were feeling and really think about our internal world, giving a visual way to show a change in mood and making us feel visible and declarative to ourselves and others. There's a lovely quote by Bob at the top saying, "Sitting and choosing our words while interacting on how everyone felt is a great way to start." Everyone benefited from their mental health and well-being. Bob said it was a great way to escape his racing thoughts, and once he was there, he felt relaxed. I said it was something constructive to do, feeling calm and relaxed. Iman felt anxious, sad, frazzled, and unsettled, but after each, she felt better. She was also inspired and enjoyed the process of making art. Claudia felt much better in her mental health.
So for creativity, there was an agreement in the comments about what people gained creatively from the sessions, with everyone mentioning being inspired by the possibilities and diversity in each other's creations. And I felt the approach to working to be delicate and freeing, going at nature's pace. Claudia touched on the opening up of creativity, of the range of possibilities, and Katie reflected on how it challenged his usual way of working.
In being with the group, Iman felt comfortable. Claudia found it very helpful. I felt happy talking about various conversations. Bob said we bonded and shared discussions together. He also said we engaged with each other.
So there was an overwhelmingly positive response to the question about how environmental art therapy might have changed people's relationship with the environment. These comments acknowledged that the experience had raised awareness of the environment, prompting care, appreciation and gratitude, feeling of being blessed to be in nature. Iman commented on how she came to see her engagement in the woodland as a way of expressing her thanks, giving something back through her creativity. Katie also spoke about engaging in the woodland as a way to escape or seek respite from a troubled world.
So what could have been done better? More sessions and longer time in the art making process. Maybe a whole day, the first half in one environment and the second half in a different environment. It would have been also great to see the environment in different seasons. It would have been good to see some artistic inspiration, perhaps a bit more historic info about each. I think if we had a larger group, maybe 2 or 3 more people, that would have been more intriguing, perhaps extending the time and perhaps expanding each other's areas, trips and other places. Next slide.
So Iman made a warm connection between the woodland garden and her grandfather's garden in Morocco and appreciated the private special place. Katie also commented on the space as a place to explore internally and externally. And Claudia made a request for further environmental art therapy, with Bob emphasising the importance of needing to care for the environment.
On reflection, we had concerns about materials. Was there enough? Will it be repetitive? Would it have been hard to work with? Leaving the work behind also in the woodland. Managing unpredictable weather like rain, lightning and heat. Having enough time for everyone, length of session and number of attendees. Managing environmental crisis activity, anxiety. Session spacing weekly and monthly. Considering working in different environments. Where to seek appropriate referrals. And WhatsApp and texting worked well to keep the group connected, but needs a monitor.
So we became aware, I'm going to add to that, sorry, it's okay. So we became aware as group members moved from 2 to 3 that the session time went quickly. With a bigger group, a session longer than 2.5 hours would be necessary because people needed time to be in the space, search, make and reflect. And as Katie mentioned, although we had good weather, the threat of storms did make us aware of the impact of the environment might have on the capacity to work outdoors. And we had the centre, but we didn't use it for working indoors. As we all chose to leave the work behind each week, recording the work photographically was an issue, and trying to photograph or record the work in a green setting made them quite hard to see. Additionally, I was aware that rather than just me photographing the work, each person might record their works in their own way. So we agreed to share images via WhatsApp. The group touched on issues in connection to environmental or climate crisis. Although this wasn't specifically part of the project aim, it was reflected upon in a more personal way in the discussions. For example, linking it to feelings of powerlessness and anxiety about future uncertainty. And then who environmental art therapy is for in the NHS is an important question. The format we developed suited our attendees who were able to manage without support between sessions. However, different levels of support and input might be needed for people who are more actively depressed or anxious around engaging in the community, or more hesitant about creating with environmental materials or in groups. So, as mentioned at the beginning of the talk, being in the environment offers a sensory immersion, a feeling of space and freedom very different from a traditional art therapy setting. Finding materials forces you to use your senses. They're not instantly available on the table. This activates selective attention through active looking. There's physical movement around the environment and activation of other senses through touch, smell and sound. Interacting with the found materials encourages creativity. There isn't a cultural template. Perhaps that's why the group was commenting upon seeing others' creative interactions as inspiring. For most people, it's a very different way to work. There are questions to ask. Can I use this? How to use it? How to combine elements? What won't work? And a whole new set of practical, creative questions to solve and ways to think about the work. Elements from the environment offer ready-made objects for projective metaphors, so you don't need to be good at art. Although all participants had creative artistic backgrounds, as there's no dominant cultural language in environmental art making, the process is very levelling and requires people to listen to each other's explanations, projections and stories in connection to the work and process. A range of cultural reflections on engaging with the environment can be evoked. Claudia mentioned her Colombian heritage and their reverence for the elements and nature, a very spiritual connection. The process of searching, creatively thinking and physically engaging appears to support imaginative play and being in the moment, enabling people to neurologically disrupt the dominant narratives such as anxiety, increasing the possible benefits of dopamine and cortisol production through finding and creating alongside connecting with others whilst being in nature. As mentioned in the feedback questions, engagement in the environment raises the participants' concern about the environment. Engaging ecologically enables a dialogue with the environment, which can help people feel less powerless in confronting global environmental concerns. Next slide. So I was asked to put in a linking slide for the wider discussions on working and thinking environmentally as art psychotherapists. So I thought I would introduce you to these terms, and I know Dominic's touched on some of them in his talk earlier. Some of you may be familiar with them, but if not, they're key concepts within environmental thinking. And I've also added the Climate Coalition logo because I think it's a very useful unifying organisation which links 130 different UK organisations who take action on climate and nature crisis. Their collective voices have more political active power with a membership of millions. So the terms at the top there are ontology, which is a branch of metaphysics dealing with the nature of being and how things relate to each other. Object-orientated ontology, or OOO for short, which is a school of thought that rejects the privilege of human existence over the existence of non-human objects. And then anthropocentrism, which is the belief that humans are the centre or most important entity in the universe, which is, like I say, key to understanding environmental philosophy. But there's no waste in nature, there's no aesthetic, we can't judge nature, and our needs are not above that of the environment. And to combat anthropocentrism, we need to show gratitude to the environment, be concerned about our impact, and reposition how we look at our relationship with the environment. And I think the project touched on elements of that. It gave us a sense of calm, gratitude, made us aware of the fragility of nature, and an understanding of our impact. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
We have
We haven't
we have
finished.
the text back.
Well, just to say thank you. But you're welcome to do it.
Yeah. Do you want to highlight the text?
Oh, I see some text in the
Yeah.
It's not, it's quite
Pale.
visible in the
Just
screen,
say
I guess,
something
just a second, sorry about that. I can see it on my screen, so I
quite
thought
pale.
it was.
I think it's because the background is actually quite dark.
Okay, I can see it
but
now.
yeah.
So that's right. Thank you for your interest, and to all who have taken part and contributed to this presentation, and to CNWL for their time and financial support. Over to you.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.
So we've got a bit of time. Are you okay to take questions?
Yeah.
So we've got a little bit of time to ask Diane and Katie questions about the project. This was a project that actually you received an award from CNWL for this. No, that was for
We've been shortlisted.
you've been shortlisted for an award. So it's been quite a prominent piece of work with the NHS context, and you can understand why. Simply because we're used to these kind of somewhat medicalised clinical spaces, but Diane, as a very experienced clinician, has really shown the NHS how things can be done differently. So I'm kind of interested if anybody has any questions. I've got a few questions, but if anybody has any questions, now is your chance. So you can just put it in the chat, or you can speak on your mic. And I've got a question, which is there's something about boundaries, because in my education as an art therapist, boundaries were like a sacred term where you had these walls, you have the relationship between your patients, and there's a very clear boundaries established in order to kind of have a therapeutic container. Yeah. Now I can see both of you presenting here as equals today. So there's one boundary, of course, which is shifted as being mutual presenters. Also, the boundaries of the space. I mean, where do they begin and end, right? So how do we understand a very well-used concept of containment? Yeah, within an environment that doesn't seem to have the kind of boundaries of a container.
Yeah. And I think that's partly why I'm quite intrigued by it myself too. And I think it's much more levelling in that respect. I think we were fortunate with the ecology centre because it does provide some boundaries. Yeah. The garden the woodland is walled. The centre is a contained centre. But yes, it still is very disconcerting. And I think it does affect your relationship with the people that you're working with. And I think it does then make you have to think very differently about the people who are potentially referred, because the hierarchy changes. It really does. So that's just one boundary. Yes, there's another question about the boundaries in the art making. Like I said, we left everything in the space. That I found that more unsettling in some ways, not having a folder in the cupboard was it's just like that. I found that quite disturbing. It still does unsettle me that the only record that we have of the work is the photographs. And I remember in week 1 I didn't photograph some of your work, and that's really stayed with me, that we have this piece of work as the first piece of work, and I don't have a record of it, and I don't quite know how it happened. We both remember it, but it's gone. As all the work's gone, but at least we have a photographic record, and I find that very, very unsettling as a concept too.
It's almost as though the works that created were eaten away, if you like, in their own environment.
Eaten away by nature.
Yes.
Yes.
Or possibly.
They emerged. We saw them, and then they moved back into the earth again. Yeah.
So in terms, because I'm thinking about containment, you have the folder definitely belongs to you. I mean, where did you feel when you're making these art pieces in nature? Do they feel like they belong to you, or do they feel like?
That's a good question.
I think we were sharing more than anything, really, our own kind of practice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So coming up with our own story, our own kind of feelings. Okay,
so something about it enabling a kind of sharing environment. So that's. What about the actual art? I'm calling it art piece, but the kind of the thing that happened, the event that happened with the natural elements, was that?
Well, it's not like being in a classroom where you're creating work in a closed environment.
Yeah.
It turns the table round.
Yeah. Okay.
It's very experiential. The experiential nature it's very much of the moment. Yeah. So you find whatever you find that day. It's seen on the day. It's held in some way with the people and in the space. And then you've already then moved on. And I don't know if the man's on the call, but she said she was telling us something about how in her art practice, things are often unfinished. Yeah. But in the sessions, she felt the piece of work was completed. And I don't know whether it's because we had a different sort of boundary that it was just finished because the time had finished. You know, it was a very different way. It's a very different way of working. It's a very different experience. I'm still trying to. It's still bringing questions for me in terms of a traditional art psychotherapy practice. Yeah.
because what I heard from the feedback, it was pretty much all positive. There were things that they felt you could have been added to it. There's nothing they wanted taken away as such. You felt like is that right?
We had a very lovely group, and like I say, they were all peer support workers. They were all practicing artists, so they were very able and brought a lot of their own capacity for self-containment, and that's where I reference, you know, it would be very different with a different cohort of people. You might have to pay more attention to boundaries and helping people to feel safe and supported.
But there was mention of improvement to mental health, for example.
There were, yeah.
Yeah, so it wasn't. So we're not talking about people who are, you know, who are without struggles, let's say.
We also brought a sense of place as well.
Interesting. Yeah, place.
Because the Holland Park is a place where I remember growing up in as a kid, going to the adventure playground, even jumping over the fence.
Okay. Yeah. So it's also a place that you would sort of sneak into or go into, you know, because it's gated, is it? It has a kind of closed.
Yeah.
So sometimes as a kid you'd jump over into that space, and so it does.
And we found an area where we could sit down and create some kind of therapeutic kind of engagement, if you like.
So it kind of has a cultural history too, something about your personal and social history, right? That's interesting.
It has, but I think the environment holds something in a way that perhaps an art therapy room does, but it's not as obvious. So you have to trust the environment. So there's a question about the materials at the beginning. Would there be enough? So you have to give a lot of trust to the environment that you will get what you need, that it will hold something of the experience, and that you can navigate your way through what might happen, you know, if there is a thunderstorm. So it's a very different multi-sensory experience rather than being in a clinical space where it's much more just held in the mind.
And it's also that element of change. There is no change when you're in the park, is there? But everything else is changing around you.
Okay, yeah. So
you're held in the moment, aren't you?
Yes.
Yeah, you're just there in the moment.
Yeah, so whilst there's things moving and there's seasons and so forth, you're saying actually there's a sense of being present, pausing in the centre of this.
Yeah.
There's a question about, because you said that people are artists and engaging with it. There's a question that's come up. I was going to ask this first, but I mean, is your sense that we need to radically rethink what therapy is, or do you think actually this is for some people and others might not really, or may even be unsettling for people that might need something else, which is traditional art therapy, let's say?
So there's a number of art therapists, environmental art therapists, as part of EAT UK, and they all work in slightly different ways. And some people do work with people who are very disturbed and have who struggle to engage, struggle to communicate. And they adapt their practice to support people who come to them with very different needs. I'm not confident enough in my practice as an environmental art therapist to be able to do that, but I'd like to think that might emerge. For me, it feels like a different way of practicing with a different client group, but like I say, other people don't. They don't see a distinction. They just adapt the practice, and they're confident to be able to hold people who are.
I think it's more about encouraging people to participate, particularly within the arts. So you're not boxed in, but you can get some fresh air and you can explore and search and find things.
And that's what I say about trusting the space. You have to trust that, the space will do that.
I mean, that's amazing. Searching and finding things, of course, we could say this is kind of like layman language for therapy, right? It's like we're searching,
like
discovering.
Almost.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's that sort of like process of discovery.
Yeah.
And it does feel very enabling of that. I guess you described being boxed in as a sort of more clinical medical environment. It's a kind of interesting contrast, and I guess we've got to think about that in terms of. I mean, I'd like to think there is something radical emerging here, which might challenge some of our assumptions about containment, for example.
And hierarchy.
Yeah, and hierarchy, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean,
Power, the power balance.
Yeah. So there's something really interesting about that. We have got a question here. Did participants feel a great connection with nature that brought increased compassion for nature and self? And she's driving, so be careful driving, because
Going to answer that one then.
yeah. So
Well,
so
definitely. I think you can see that in the feedback. Yeah, everybody commented on how it had changed their perception of nature in a positive way.
And I think a lot of the time we weren't aware of what we were creating. It was this act of creating that brought us together and had meaningful conversations about what we found.
yeah, so there's definitely a very profound sense of sharing, right? So it's somehow enabled finding a shared space in a way that might be different to, let's say, a clinical environment.
Or in a class environment.
A class, so really, so again, I'm hearing like boxed in, classroom environment, and that we're seeing that much more as kind of clinical environment. And from your point of view, Katie, you're saying, well, actually, this is a kind of open, shared, less hierarchical space.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
So what we might think of as, oh, isn't it scary letting go of the boundaries? Other people experience it as, oh, isn't that liberating? The boundaries are different.
Yeah.
And whose holding that anxiety? Is it us as therapists?
Yeah.
Does it? Yeah. I think that's an interesting question.
So how does it relate to mental health change then, do you think? So if we're to say, like, of course, then the NHS effectiveness and outcomes are the big things, evidence-based practice and so on. Like, can we, like, guess, if you like, what might be
it's almost
changing?
as if you're quite wild in that kind of space.
Okay.
Like we're all animals, aren't we? So we all, do strange things, and this is only stepping stones to, coming out, if you like.
I love that. I love that.
It is. There's a freedom. There's a freedom with it, and you do go through a sort of a bit of a journey with it, where you're like, oh, how can I use this? Oh, I can do something really different with it.
Yeah.
And it really opens your mind to a whole new set of possibilities. And I think that does have a repercussion internally about boundaries and what is possible, and change is possible, and sometimes in really surprising ways that you hadn't considered. And I think what was magnified for us was doing that in a group. I really hadn't expected that.
Yeah.
And there are people that work individually doing environmental art therapy, but I thought the group was really fascinating, that everybody was so intrigued by what other people were doing, how they produced something. Oh my gosh, how have you done that? It's the inside of a berry or something. So it was very, very different from just using pastels or felt tips in an art therapy space. It felt really quite liberating.
And it was quite broad as well, because we did write on stones, which sounds really bizarre, but it was more about what comes to mind, not about what we're going to be doing, but let's.
So it's quite organic.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I just want to go back to something, because it kind of made me feel differently about the process, which was feeling like, okay, we're all animals, right? Number one. Number two, I could be wild. I sort of felt like, well, actually, there's something about accepting who we are and sort of thinking about how we create a genuinely non-judgmental environment, right? So, can we be wild together? And is it okay? Does it feel safe? Yeah. And the other thing you said was about coming out. Like, this is something we might have to, we might be somewhat conformist in some environments. The way that you're being wild actually sounds quite sociable and shared and caring. And I'm sort of interested in this idea of this different kind of, this sort of liberated wildness. Like this sort of reminded me of the, the kind of natural flower, wild flower sort of gardens, where you just,
pick up buttercups and put them under your chin.
Yes, exactly.
But I think that's. So Katie mentioned about coming out, but I think it's almost like a return, because it links a lot with play, and if you played as a child, it reminded me quite a lot of play. And it's only when you start to grow up a bit that people sort of say, oh no, don't pick that up or put that down, or your hand's going to get dirty. Or so we're brought back under some control. So it feels like a liberation to say, do you know, actually, you don't need to keep doing that anymore. You're allowed to play with the mud and get your hands dirty. And it does feel like, it feels quite liberating and playful.
Wow. Is there any, just thinking about the conversation we've been having, are there any questions we've got about Diane and KD? So
We didn't
keep,
erase the stones.
yeah, did you keep
The stones? That was something we could keep in the end.
Okay. Did you keep what was written on them, or did you erase it, or what happened to the
No,
writing?
we kept them.
You kept them.
We tried to collect as much.
Clean the stones the feeling stones were cleaned off each week.
Oh yes, because
mood was-
we rewrote what we thought of.
Yeah. So is there anything that you kept from the?
Only what photographs that I had.
What photographs? Yes, that's the only things that came away with you were these kind of digital
Yeah.
prints, so to speak. That's interesting.
I found that quite hard, to be honest.
Yeah.
I would quite like to. You two kept your pieces on me to have kept your pieces.
But then we would have had a lot of stones then.
Or we would have, or pieces of wood, or all sorts of things. Yeah.
I can see Emily in I think Toulouse is asking, isn't what we need to connect through creation, connect with wild, that is soft and sweet and natural, accepting of feeling.
Well, I think what environmental art therapy offers is a whole range of possibilities to connect to. So we've talked about being wild. Yes, there's a softness, but it can be difficult. It can be harsh. It incorporates change, which includes death as well as birth. So it has a huge range, and some of the original environmental art therapy projects in the environmental therapy trainings in the UK goes to a full year. So you get that full cycle of the year, including death, including decay, and then the rebirth that emerges from that. And so they see the cycle as very important. So it isn't just about one aspect, something more delicate or beautiful, but it incorporates a whole range of what the environment
is doing and being
does,
and
how our humanity connects to that too. We have a whole cycle and a whole range as human beings.
And it suggests it could be violent at times as well.
Exactly.
So you have to be careful, like the idea of picking things up could be quite dangerous or harmful.
Yeah, like spiky things, for
Yeah.
example, or maybe the bee there or something.
Or even mushrooms.
Or mushrooms.
Picking mushrooms up that you're not aware of.
Yes, could be poisonous.
So there is a risk. There is actually a real risk.
Physical risk,
Yeah. You do, so there is a boundary. You do have to be conscious of that. Yes.
So who keeps an eye on that boundary?
Yeah.
I think mind does that itself, doesn't it?
So you feel like you as a group you could.
You have to, but I can't follow everybody while they're wandering around the woodland. You know.
No, and of course people do that. I mean, people live, in social environments. We have gardens and so forth.
It's about
so
being responsible as well.
Yeah. I've got just one more question. It is. Oh, we've got another question here before I ask mine. So how did the season in which you did the work impact the group? The work. Thank you, Marlies.
We were very lucky that we did it in the summertime and not in the winter.
Yeah.
Because it would have been very cold.
But did it mean something in that context? I mean, would you think you would have produced different kinds of assemblages, for lack of a better word, but these things happening would have been different if let's say you were in the autumn or the spring? Do you think it would have altered your perceptions or group experience?
I think we would have found a lot less if we did it at another season, definitely.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, it's the season.
It is interesting. We haven't done it. I'd be happy to do another trial, do it longer.
Yes.
We talked about that. There's a lot of people. There's people who've got in touch with me since who would be interested in another project, because it'd be interesting. What do you do if it's raining or it's cold, or how do you manage that? Yeah. We had a bit of an idyll in some 6 very nice hot sessions.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting question, how it alters the environment around you and how you then respond to that situation.
So on that note, I've just got one more question, which is, so we've talked about the box and the classroom as being sort of unnatural in some ways. Can we bring some of these principles into those spaces to change those spaces?
People do. People do bring environmental materials inside to
Work on.
work on. Yeah, and so using natural materials alongside traditional artistic materials. I'm sure a lot of people do that anyway.
Yeah.
But yes, there might be more of a conscious effort to do that.
And could this extend to the actual environment itself? Because we tend to become, like in some ways, to my mind, overly familiar with our sort of clinical environments. Become, the spaces and become predictable and so forth. But can they be perceived in an unpredictable way, in the ways that these natural environments are kind of somewhat unpredictable?
I've thought a bit more about that as well, because so I did an art training before I did art psychotherapy training, and it's a bit more like being at an art school than being in an art therapy setting. So it's a bit more like a studio setting.
Yeah.
So it's got that freedom and the explorative nature within it.
Yeah.
Which I think we're losing in some clinical settings. It has just become more a table and cupboards and the blank walls.
Yeah.
Whereas, bringing something in the environment in, there's nothing to say that people can't experiment with opening up boundaries within an art psychotherapy setting. Yeah, to challenge themselves, if you like.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
So
there's a question about the risk assessment. So yes, the risk assessment is needed. Is the short answer to that one.
Yeah.
And and there's a very real risk assessment, but there's a psychological risk assessment. So can people manage that, the uncertainty, the changeability, the fact that they do have to take a bit more responsibility for themselves? Yeah, all of that's considered.
Great. Well, congratulations both of you. I think it's a really, really powerful and profound project. So thank you for sharing it with us. I think it's really exciting, the work you're doing. I'm looking forward to seeing how it evolves. So thank you. So we're going to have a 5-minute break. So next we've got Marlies Swanepoel in South Africa. Now I know Marlies because at one point she was part of our service in Northwest London as a drama therapist, before returning back to South Africa. And some time after she'd been there, she invited me to help with a project about mapping arts-based psychosocial practices in South Africa. I didn't quite realise what I was getting into, Marlies, because it's much more complex than I anticipated. But it was actually one of the most rich, interesting kind of learning experiences for me as a kind of white man from the UK going into South Africa, trying to make sense of what was really complex social, political environments. It humbled me a lot. And the work that Marlies is doing is remarkable. As director of Spiel, which is an arts-based sort of psychosocial practice organisation, working with lots of communities who have really been affected by colonisation and transgenerational trauma. And she's really brought kind of, I would say, indigenous knowledges and kind of collective experiences into the forefront as a way of really addressing some of the big challenges we face, particularly in the West. So, as I said, drama therapist by background, and so, but really, when I saw Marlies, there's a lot more than drama. There's a lot of visual work that goes on with image making. There's a lot of embodied work that happens. There's musicality. So although Marlies calls herself a drama therapist, actually it sort of transverses the arts in terms of what I saw. And she works with lots of different arts modalities and art therapists and musicians and all sorts. So it's kind of this real collaborative sense of community space. So
thank you, Dominique, and thank you to Katie and Diane for opening the space and opening the evening in such a profound way. It was so exciting to hear about what's happening over there, and a part of me felt very jealous that I couldn't still be there. And yes, so thank you for that. And I also want to say thank you for the invitation, for having me. I feel very grateful to be able to speak with you. I'm very immersed as it is as I'm sitting here in this moment, in this work, because I'm calling you from the middle of a project. We've just done 2 days and we've just driven the whole day to another place. And whilst I'm based in Cape Town, tonight I'm in a place called Addo, which is very close to an elephant park. And on our drive here, I actually saw a huge herd of antelope, or springbokken as we know them, which was also in I think in one of Dominique's slides. And here in South Africa, they mean energy, they mean movement. So if you see them, there's a message of stamina. And I'm hoping that there's some of that in the work that we're going to do tonight, as we are getting closer to the end of the year, getting closer to this time of closing. And maybe some of this work can hold the spirit of the springbok, the antelope, for us. I am founding director of Speel Arts Therapies Collective. It's a non-profit organization. And like Dominique said, we are arts therapists, mostly drama therapists at the moment. And in South Africa, we are registered with the Health Professions Council of South Africa, and we collaborate with applied arts practitioners, arts activists, and artists. And we are working in developing community-based models of mental health care that can affect social change. I briefly wanted to speak to maybe changing the title a little bit. I have it up here as a South African perspective, and not rather than a global South perspective, because I think we are going to retire that term. It has a bit of a, it's become a bit of a political slogan, and it comes from things like third world country and developing countries, and it's not serving our purpose of equality and change. And so also because I don't want to actually be representative of the voice of the global South. So rather tonight, a South African perspective on culturally informed arts-based psychosocial practices. And we'll unpack those terms a little bit, and we'll have perhaps a brief experiential process. And I'll speak to some of the examples of practice as well towards the end. So thank you, Sena. We can go to the next slide. This is the work that Dominique spoke about. This is a model or a framework for this work. It's called Families and Collective Futures, and it was in collaboration with Brunel University that Dominique came over and developed this logic model. It addresses intergenerational and complex trauma by strengthening circles of support, psychosocial circles of support in communities, and with the ultimate goal to heal and to affect social change. So thank you. Let's go to the next slide, please. I'm briefly going to share a bit of our understanding of culturally informed practice. So it's that idea of a responsiveness to diversity and a practice that is outside of the dominant Western medical model. And it includes indigenous knowledge systems. So from a South African perspective and practices in health and well-being, we've learned the following, that health is in relation to others. I am because we are, and you may have heard the Zulu term of Ubuntu. So therefore, our health practices need to focus on the collective and not just on the individual. Building on that, health, mental health, physical health, spirituality, and culture are all interconnected concepts, and they all affect each other. And Dominique also mentioned that already, that it makes no sense to work with the arts as separate modalities. And I think that's one of the things I've had to unlearn from my training in the UK as a drama therapist, that one of my colleagues say, when the drums play, we dance. And it's a strange concept that we practice arts separately. And then focusing on tonight's topic, the relationship with nature is absolutely integral to health and well-being. In fact, it's inseparable. And I've listed some, I'm hearing my sound is going weird. Just let me know if you're struggling to hear me.
It's fine, we can hear you fine.
Okay. So I've listed some women, some South African women's who's writing about this practice. And I actually am also going to share another resource with you, maybe via email, in some way, that was published this year by von Fritschen and Dos Santos, and it's entitled Perspectives on Music Healing by Traditional Healers and Music Therapists, and was published in Music Therapy Perspectives, and I think that's quite an important voice to add to this. But the image that you are seeing here is one of our workshops that we ran with a group of police and forensic social workers who works in a child and family protection unit. And this is a big tree just outside of the town in which they practice. And we had to take them to this tree. The environment where they were working at were dire and grim, and the buildings are dilapidated. And so there was something about moving the work to this tree. And it made me think something that came up in Diane and Katie's presentation about nature then becoming another facilitator in the process. Thanks, Sina. Let's move on to the next one. Sinetemba Makanya is a drama therapist and a Sangoma. And she says, with this idea of interconnectivity, that as health is a balance of everything in existence, disease then results from the breakdown in relatedness, including disharmony between the individual and the rest of the universe. And this work is very much about repairing or restoring that harmony, that connection to others and to our environments, and to access the healing potential of nature within that. So thank you. We can carry on. Before we get to this part, but we can stay on the slide, I also just want to say we are basing the practice as a psychosocial practice. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about how this informs my more traditional clinical practice. I run a private practice in Cape Town, and I've learned so much from this community-based work. And I hope that there'll be something in that for you as well. I hear the echo. Yeah, I'm sorry. Let me know if there's something I can do on my side.
No, Marlies, we muted ourselves, don't worry.
Thank you. And I have to say, I think such a huge deal of this process and trying to get the connection and managing our load shedding, which means our country ran out of power and we all have to take turns with the power we get. And driving long distances to get to the work, whenever I feel like, it really brings home what does it mean to try and create access into spaces where there isn't arts-based psychosocial practice, or it's where infrastructure is so scarce and resources are difficult to get to. So I really think this work has a powerful place in that. But having said all of that, I think that was a broad introduction and an umbrella. And I'm going to invite you to join me in a bit of a creative exploration. It's just for you, because of the nature of how we are set up. I don't think we'll process or reflect much about on the work that we're going to create. And may it be a resource, may it be something to take with you. And there is an invitation to share, of course, if you like, with Dominique at the end. And then perhaps we can create something collective out of this. But let's see. Let's first take a moment to see where we are at. I can't see you, so you must talk to me if I need to know anything. But find your feet, notice where they are at, and gently rub the palms of your hands together. Thank you. Begin to rub the palms of your hands together vigorously, if you like. If you are in a cold space, I'm going to be gentle because it's so hot here. And then perhaps put one palm on your heart and one palm on your belly or your gut. Just take a moment to breathe, to feel your heart, feel your breath. No need to change anything, just noticing. And the sensation of warm palms on the body. And then you can let that go and bring your palms together again. And imagine that your hands are made out of clay. And I'm going to count to 8 and see if you can come up with an image and a shape, and let your hands and the movement guide you, not the mind, not now, into some kind of shape. I think that represents the season you find yourself in at the moment. So let's go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Just take a moment to look at what you've made. If you can, raise your hands or bring it to the camera so we can see. We can see these hand sculpts. From here, I'm going to count us down and let your hands instinctively move to the opposite of this image. So we're going to go from 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And again, just notice for yourself if anything has changed, and if it did, how does it look different? Maybe how it feels different. And then you can let that go. Oh, I wish I could, okay, maybe we'll reflect on this later. I'm just also checking time. But there's just something about noticing the space in between and the movement from one state of being to the next. And perhaps what that does internally, how the body is talking, reacting in this invitation to move between images. For those of you who have pieces of paper ready, please, and nothing fancy, anything will do, bring that, as well as maybe some pens or crayons or art materials. I'm going to tell you a creation myth, a story from the Khoisan people. And one of the musicians that we work with, who is from the San tribe, told me it's okay to tell the story. So I feel I have permission to share this. And while I do so, won't you place one of your hands on a piece of paper and just trace your fingers? So you're going to do that in your own time as you listen to the story. It's a very short story. It's called Mantis and the Flower. In the time before time, long time ago, Bee carried Mantis over a vast expanse of water. And Bee flew and flew and flew and flew with Mantis until he felt like he could not fly any further. And then he spotted it, right there on the water, a flower with its leaves cupped open. And Bee flew down and gently placed Mantis in the flower. And so began Mantis, the first one, the maker of fire and the keeper of the dream. And so began Mantis, the first one, the maker of the fire and the keeper of the dream. And while these images are floating around cyberspace between us. There's an invitation to see if there's something from the story that you feel drawn to as a source, as a resource, that you may want to quickly draw in the palm of your hand, just a marking or a shape, or perhaps a symbol of something of the story. These ideas are around Deb Dana's concept of glimmers, and I'll talk a bit about that later. But for now, let's begin with a thumb, and we'll think about fire and an invitation to find a glimmer for yourself. A glimmer is something that's nourishing, that's resourcing. And if we use or we apply the metaphor of fire, the element of fire, to think about what is it that brings me warmth? What is it that creates that sense of warmth in me? And I know this is kind of very symbolic, but we need to bring it down to something really practical, such as having a cup of tea, perhaps with someone that I love, or a hug, or someone said today, being with my dog at the end of the day, or making a fire. But your glimmer, your one thing for now, could be many and it can change, but what can you think of for now that has to do with fire and heat, and that brings you nourishment and joy? And you can write that down in the thumb, or you can draw it, you can make a symbol for it, however you wish. And I'm going to go through this quite quickly because of our time. So the next finger would be water. And it's a similar invitation. What is it about this element that nourishes you, that supports you? Being with water, being inside water, looking at water. And let this be an instinctive response. Don't think about it too much. And then the next one is thinking about air. Air and wind and breath and movement, perhaps. And then we go to earth, the things that grounds us, the things that helps us to feel present and here. And it is about getting our hands dirty in nature, like Katie and Diane said, walking barefoot on the grass, baking something, feeding ourselves with something delicious. And then there's a last finger left. And that's for a person. And it may change. But the name of someone that is a source of support. We cannot do this thing by ourselves. We need each other. We need people. And this glimmer map won't be complete without the name of someone. And sometimes we also say, if that person's name doesn't come to mind right now, there's also something about the connection to a higher being or spiritual practice that is resourceful. So whatever you choose for now, try and find a way to put that down in the final finger. And then I hope this didn't feel too rushed. There's an invitation to cut out this glimmer map, and it becomes something different if it gets cut out. And if you want to take a picture and share it, you can. But if you want to just live with it a little bit and may it be a mirror to you of some of the things available, some of the resources that are immediate, that are the things that we can move our bodies with and through and taste and see and feel as ways of supporting and nourishing. And these are things, and it links to some concepts that I'll talk about later, but these are things that are in the palm of our hands, that are within reach, are practical to us. And the Deb Danas, who came up with the idea of glimmers, said that the idea is to have them nearby, to have them visible, because they are for the times when we are dysregulated. They are for the times when we go lost the thinking. mind and a reminder of, oh, here it is, here's what's available. So for now, with the promise of perhaps engaging with these glimmer maps at a later stage, won't you just take care of your piece and put it somewhere safe, somewhere accessible? And I'm going to move on and link this work into some of the theories. And please interrupt me and ask questions if you need to. But before we go back to the PowerPoint, I first want to share a little bit something about the rest of the title, The Lessons from the Bees. Okay, we can go. Oh yes, Senna, maybe go one back, please. This was the holding image for the glimmer maps and a group of people that we worked with in the Cederberg, creating their glimmer maps, which I wanted to share, but we can carry on, thank you. Senna, this is such an ugly picture. Please, please will you take it down for a moment while I share this story, the story behind that. Thank you. So the bees have been around recently, and besides bringing inspiration to share the creation myth of this bee just carrying and carrying and carrying and carrying the God of creation until it finds, it spots that moment of potential, of something opening, of space happening for creation to begin. So there's that image for this time of year. But also towards the end of September, when I was preparing for a significant trip, the bees flew into my life. And we were at home, and one day we noticed this massive swarm outside. And myself and my family ran to close all the doors and the windows. And then we just watched with fascination as this dark cloud swirled outside our house for a little while, and then they disappeared. And this happened twice. And then the day before I flew to join other social impact leaders in Istanbul to talk about grassroots practices from a South-South perspective that addresses the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So that was the context of going to Istanbul. And the day before I flew, I spotted the hive. So the bees made a home right outside my bedroom window. And my alternative medicine friend said, that's a sign. And my husband said we had to get rid of them. And so I listened to both, and Ben, the beekeeper, came and he rehomed the bees. But I started reading about them and found fascinating lessons, which I think can hold the work that I wanted to share with you tonight. So let's go to their first lesson, please, Senna. I didn't take a picture of the bees, so that's why I had that other one up. They communicate with each other by dancing. There's 9 different bee dances to speak about grooming and where there's nectar, or there's even a happy dance. And I'd like to talk about, with these bodies talking to each other, a bit about the idea of embodied cognition, the wisdom of the body in relation to others and the environment, and the way we connect and communicate with each other. In this approach, we begin with the body as the first source of knowledge. And we'll drill into this a little bit deeper in a moment. Secondly, everything a bee needed to know is already in their genetic makeup. So as the worker bee grows older, hormones are released and activating the part of their genetics, which tells them which job to do and when to do it. And then I read the Sumo Kids book of the Secret Lives of Bees. And if you've read that, all the different roles that bees play in the hive. It's really fascinating. And they instinctively know. Knowledge that's is within of what to do. And it's knowledge that's been known forever. It's indigenous. It's the wisdom that's in the hive. And this is the approach we are taking in this work. We are not the experts. We are not the only experts in mental health who come in and talk about trauma or how to deal with it. We make the spaces. We are co-creating these circles that feel safe enough just in the moment, because we cannot assume that we create safe spaces, just safe enough in the moment so that participants' innate knowledge can be heard and shared. This image was with a group, and I think we asked them to create a sculpt of what does the term psychosocial mean, and it transpired that there isn't what does the term psychosocial mean in an African language, in isiXhosa. It turns out there isn't a term for that, and but there's something about the healing we find with each other. We are social, and that informs our spirits and our health and our well-being, and it's all connected. It's not a separate concept. And the third lesson is about the sweet, sweet, sweet honey that was just everywhere in Istanbul. All those sweet shops where there's actually little tables and chairs outside that invite you to sit down and enjoy and take your time to take in the honey, the baklava, and the Turkish delights. And that speaks to a healing-centered or strength-based approach, which the arts therapies are doing. But we'll go into that a little bit more. But it's about not celebrating the strengths and the resources that's already there and not working from a place of deficit. And in the African narrative, that's really important in terms of the image that's been created around Africa as a needy place and a place that's under-resourced. So we work from a place of strength and what we already have. These concepts are framed really nicely by Sylvia Tamale's book, Decolonization and Afrofeminism, where she takes ideas of a Black feminist womanist paradigm from an African perspective. And it's about, again, three things, just briefly: a theoretical frame outside the dominant Western and white narrative psychological theories. And it centers the voices of participants, taking into account the intersectionality of culture, race, and gender, and other forms of oppression. And it also supports, again, a healing-centered approach, intergenerational strategies of coping, such as mothering and using mutual self-aid and spirituality as a means for solving problems. So she feels like a very important voice to bring into when we describe some of these lessons. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. I don't know in how much detail to go into about the concept, but maybe just briefly, thinking about that idea of dualism or the disembodied mind, the way we live our lives from here upwards, that stemmed from the 7th century and then gained traction in the Western world. It just doesn't exist in an African perspective. It never was endorsed, this body and mind division. And instead, there's an emphasis of the unity in relationship with the wider cosmos. So in the West, the concept of embodied cognition emerged around the 20th century. And it proposes that the thinking mind is influenced and in fact guided by our physical experiences. Wilson and Golonka says, embodied cognition does not simply represent another source of information for the mind, but it sees the body as navigating the world and solving problems in real time. So this idea invites us to centralize the role that the body plays on human behaviors. Because when we view a person's responses from a position of embodied cognition, we can understand that whilst internal mental representations play a role in determining behaviors, a person also draws immediate cues from the body and from the environment, which determines their actions. And it's much like the concept of neuroception from Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory. Therefore, the argument is that behaviors can be changed through listening and responding to the body's cues in real time. And this is the spaces that healing is able to take place in. I think I want to briefly just share this image of a couple that in an exercise of tuning in with each other, feeling each other's bodies, heartbeat, breath. And in this particular moment, it was a workshop in an area called Worcester earlier this year, which was struck by floods on the weekend that this work happened. And we were stuck in that hotel for 2 days because the whole town around us were flooded. And the people in this room came from the farms. And so while we were there, they were receiving news of their homes being flooded. And there was just a sense of a moment of creating this place of connecting, of sitting with each other in a space that doesn't have words yet. And then I didn't have a slide about this, but recently someone shared this with me, which I have to add. It's from the perspective of the medical anthropologists, specifically Skipper Hughes and Locke. And they wrote this book in 1987 already. And I'm just going to read you the quote, and it speaks to this image in front of us. They say, the language of the body is vastly more ambiguous or overdetermined than speech. We might perhaps think of those essentially wordless encounters between mother and infant, lover and beloved, mortally ill patient and healer, in which bodies are offered, unreservedly presented to the other as prototypical. In collective healing rituals, there's a merging, a communion of mind, body, self, other, individual, group that acts largely non-verbally and even pre-reflexive ways to feel the sick person back to a state of wellness and wholeness, to feel each other back to a state of wellness. We can go to the next slide that refers, talks about our work and how bodies in nature feeling each other and the environment creates these spaces of in-between states of where there's potential for another narrative. These learners come from very dense urban schools in deprived areas of Cape Town, and so we took field trips to places nearby where the work happened. And I think I'm going to ask you to just go to the next slide, Senna, so we can hear their words or one of their reflections on their experience of it. You might have noticed that we're a generation that keeps to ourselves, and we don't trust anyone with our feelings and our thoughts, especially because we don't know how to talk about our feelings and our thoughts. We've come to show us that we can also show you through our songs and through our dances how we feel and what we are thinking. And that is freedom. In these spaces, we can shift away from the narrative of the mind and the narrative of the intergenerational stories and find this freedom. Thank you. Let's go to the next one. This is an example of how this work trickled down into private practice. And I'm not going to read the quote because I know these slides will be available. Checking the time. But this is an image that was created of a landscape. So I often use the guiding image of a landscape as a starter, as a beginning. And this particular client, this isn't her image because I met her on Zoom, and we used pieces of clothing if nothing else was available. But she was invited to create an image of a landscape, and she made 2 trees and an empty space in the middle with spiky leaves growing around, and then a single little flower that was growing in the middle, and she named that flower Life. And this client at the time was suffering from a UTI, and the image had helped her to engage with this infection as something that flared up from the body to draw her attention to a womb story that needed expression. Her body-mind came to alert her to something that needed her attention and that was influencing her current relationship. So she could name it, and she worked with it in this space. And as always the case is when we listen from the inside out, when we hear what the message from the body is, like Dr. Gabor Mate is saying, the message from illness, the message behind illness. There's also a gift in that, because coming back to this very fragile flower that she drew there, when her journey started 2 years ago, she said, I'm a black hole of nothing. Nothing grows inside me. It's an empty space. And then look what her body is showing back to her. Something that's alive, something that's growing in that space. Yeah. As always, we know this work. We know how it speaks. So let's go to the next slide. And the next lesson is about indigenous knowledge, the knowledge that's within. We spoke about this woman today. She's a force. Lindy Dlamini is a Sangoma, a traditional healer. And she says, there's something that we can see that to the West may seem crazy. But as an African child, we say, speak, and you come, and you do your thing, and you dance and you sing, and it happens in circles, it continues. And now we come with this fancy stuff, the West that says, oh, we have women's circles, but we've always had these circles. We were born into circles. We're born into the fluidity of the circles. There's a concept called weird, and I have to read it. Weird, Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic theories of psychology, and they do not translate in a South African setting, in South settings we are talking about. In South Africa, the dominant medical model has failed to integrate with traditional and indigenous healing practices, despite some ongoing efforts. But in many cultures, in many South African cultures, knowledge is passed on orally. It's not a written tradition. Knowledge lies in the hands and the hearts and the bodies and the stories of people. But like Sylvia Tamale said, coloniality continues to enforce power structures that favors knowledge production from a Western perspective. And it was really beautiful to hear Katie and Diane speak about what happens in the relationship as well, the leveling when we are outside and we are creating with nature. And I want to add to that, so the practice of applying the arts to intentionally center innate and indigenous knowledge can be seen as an act of decoloniality. And this point is beautifully illustrated again by the participants' words in the next story. Let's go to the next slide, please. They created this story around the idea, around the guiding metaphor of spring. And it says, a woman who was from the land did not think she knew anything about trees. And these were a group of apple workers, they worked on apple farms. But she worked on a struggling tree with her hands. And she knew the tree needed water and she knew the tree needed food. So she took to pruning and caring for the tree. And then life came. And the woman found herself again because she did not know that she had the knowledge in her. And she never went to school and she did not have the knowing of the books, but she had the knowing of her hands. A participant reflected on the story and he said, this method showed us our creativity. These stories come from us, not from books. And it came to teach us things that we never knew about. The knowing of the hands, the innate knowledge that's already there in the palms of our hands. And again, this is how we brought this work into, we can bring this work into private practice. And this is an example of a glimmer map. And I've mentioned this is an idea from Deb Dana, and it just speaks to triggers, to this idea of triggers. So what sends our nervous system into a fight, flight, freeze response? Glimmers are the things that guides our ventral vagal system into a place of regulation, in a place of safety and connection. And I wanted to share these words of someone who worked on this glimmer map. She's from the Eastern Cape. She's from where I am now, which is very rural and remote. And then she came to study in the city. And she said, these sessions reminded me of our way of life back home. The sun. We sit outside rotating with the sun the whole day. And past these villages and I see what she meant. We sell water for watering vegetables and everything. In the air, we would let the wind blow on us while the sun hit our melanated skin. And if the wind was too much, we would cling together because it would not blow us as a unit. Fire. We made imbawulo brazier, which is a container for flames. And whenever it was cold, And we would sit around it and talk until there's no coal left. Earth, we walk barefoot most of the time, and I never understood the healing power of being in contact with the soil. This is that exists within this knowledge system, and the medicine that is available in spaces where there's absolutely very little access to any other of the more Western forms of therapeutic interventions, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, let's go on to the next slide, please. And I think this is the last one. Yes, we also spoke about this man today, and I'm going to try and do his name justice. Dr. Kobani Kambela, an isiXhosa medical anthropology lecturer. He says, sometimes I think we also neglect that we inherit so much beauty from our ancestral archive, and resilience and joy and so many, many things that I think we forget that we haven't just inherited trauma, but we've also inherited love and joy and gifts and so many, many things. It's about focusing on the sweetness of life, on the honey, in a strength-based or healing-centered approach. So the idea of trauma-informed practice has been around for a while and hugely popular. And voices like Ellie Scrine, Sean Jenwright came with a sense of the idea of a healing-centered approach, an approach that harvests the strengths and the resources and not just focus on the trauma. And it's a holistic approach that also involves looking at culture and spirituality and the healing capacity of the collective. And this is a group of mothers and daughters who were doing one of the programs. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Anchoring this idea of a healing-centered approach in practice, I want to briefly speak to the use of ritual. I was trained in a ritual model of drama therapy. And this image is the performance of an indigenous Khoisan ritual. And it's an example of seeking and activating the inherent resources of a group. And this was done with a group of agri-workers on a farm that's far remote in the mountains, and 5 generations of workers are living on this farm. Here, Gershon Lombard, an arts activist, closed one of our programs with a traditional ritual of Thanksgiving. And he was burning plants from the farm, from the land, indigenous plants that were sourced and used as medicine plants. And in this moment, it was really poignant to witness the elderly. What you don't see in the picture is around him, there's a group of people sitting and watching the sunset. And they were beckoning him closer so they could inhale. And there was a sense of remembering. One person said that it brought him a sense of shame that he forgot, but also a desire to reconnect to his roots. Decades of proclaimed white superiority and the influence of coloniality has segregated these rituals to secondary, to less than. And this is an act of remembering, of recentering the medicine that is already there, that exists within. We can go to the next slide, please. Just a brief example from ritual and private practice and how some of these ideas can be used. Again, this was with someone online, so this image is representative of the vignette. But it's a woman who suffers from depression and eating disorder, and she mourned. She was grieving for her mother, and she found in that process the symbol of the rose as representing her own mother, but also her inner mother. And at the time of this session, her mother wound had opened up again because she was due to go and do a wedding dress fitting. And she created a ritual for herself around the rose and rose oil. And as it happens, the rose is used in Chinese, Ayurvedic, Indian, indigenous medicine as something to treat depression, as a muti for the heart. And she practiced this ritual as a way of honoring her mother and the calling in the mother in herself, and also to heal from the loss in the moment. Oh, I have so much more to say about ritual and nature and practice with nature, but yes, let me close there and to just say thank you for journeying with me to bring all of this together. Is these 3 lessons from the bees, and I hope that they have sparked some ideas and some thoughts, and I'd love to hear from you. If we have time, Dominique, I don't know. I've lost my last page of presentation, so I think that is what I wanted to say.
So,
Thank
Marlies,
you.
thank you. Yes, no, thank you. I sort of felt myself welling up a few times because it is like profoundly emotional on a social, personal, cultural kind of level. So I really appreciate your ability to bring that into these spaces in a kind of in this virtual capacity. So thank you. It's been a real kind of gift in a way. I think we forget sometimes, at least I do, just the kind of profound impact of colonization, but also the kind of healing potential that can be inspired through these kinds of arts-based practices. So like I said, I think that is a real gift to all of us, to remind us of just some of the damage that's happened in the past, but also some of the wonderful kind of rejuvenation and drawing on this kind of life, vitality, and sort of to life. Yeah. So we have got time now for some questions. Maybe also there's something what I heard Emily say was something about this shift in kind of power dynamics. We heard this with Diane and Katie as well. That some context enabled this sort of sharing space where you were involved as much in some ways. And maybe Emily was saying something about this healing, learning sort of journey together. We're sure you're invited as a kind of facilitator, but maybe Emily's also saying that there's something being facilitated for you as well. And so how do we unpack that? How do we make sense of that? Yeah, it's interesting. What are your thoughts, Marlies?
I think that is true for any therapeutic engagement. I mean, we know that we are always standing to be changed and moved by our encounters. So I don't think it's anything new, but I think the intentional way of working with a collective and not with an individual does shift. It dilutes the power dynamic, and it's always in those moments where someone in the group takes over the playlist, or what happened today, just started organizing the temperature in this very hot room, where we go, this is the group is taking over this space. This is their space. The circle has formed, you know. And yes, of course we are changed by that. We also say that these pictures, they don't belong to us. We don't take the pictures, so we are not the only one taking pictures in the rooms. Sometimes other people are taking pictures as well. And then we find a way of sharing them. So someone in the group would offer to give their number, and we all pull the pictures in there, because it really is exactly what you speak to, a principle of we are not like I think research has perpetrated on Africa for centuries. So we cannot take the images as ours to go and present somewhere. It belongs within the group. It belongs to the collective. And absolutely everyone has given their consent for its use.
We've got a question from Diane. I think, Diane, do you want to come here and...
I was also struck by the comment about one of your contributors was commenting on feeling shame. And I wanted to pick up on that, because it made me think about how we all potentially have a sense of shame, because we've all moved away from our connection to the land and our environment because of industrialization, because of capitalism, and yeah, we've all
Mm,
been disconnected
mm,
across,
mm.
regardless of what country we're in, and it's ongoing. We get further and further removed and more disconnected, and I think that's why many people, not just in the arts therapy world, are trying to get reconnected to the earth and to their environments,
The land,
because I
yeah,
realise that disconnect. I'm not going to get too political, but I think you can follow that trajectory for yourselves.
yeah, yeah. Thanks, Diane. Yeah.
Thank you, Diane. I think it's, I mean, this idea that in different contexts we've become disconnected in different kinds of ways, and how we reconnect. It's there's something that resonates obviously in the West, and with this kind of intersectionist. But we've got a question from Ivan, who's a colleague in Brunel, and he says, "Thank you for the stimulating panel. I'm reflecting on the theme of the session, that of art therapy and ecology, and I'm interested in how ecological thinking can be stimulated in the context of art therapy. In the previous panel, the question of boundaries and their undoing came up. It looks to me that the concept of nature itself, it's a boundary making one, one that separates what we understand being the line between organic and inorganic, homemade and industrial, city and countryside. Current ecological thinking in object-oriented ontologies was cited amongst others by Diane. This points at the commodified character of nature as a separate entity. I wonder how these experiences can inform those ideas or confront them. So there's quite a lot in there. Even maybe you can speak to Marlies about this, because we're looking at boundaries and how we've constructed boundaries. You're saying that actually there are these these sort of constructions, these discrete entities.
Hi.
Yeah, Eva, do you want to sort of maybe ask Marlies? Yeah.
Yeah, hi, sorry. I'm unfortunately I've bad problem with my laptop, so I'm on my phone. That's why my video is not active. First of all, apologies, because I feel like a stalker, and I know that's not a pleasant feeling. Thank you so much for such an interesting panel and this paper. I guess my question came from how much the concept of nature. This is a panel about art therapy and ecology and the relationship with ecology stuff. How much the concept of nature, in a way, is naturalized, how we use it as a shorthand for something other from the space where you are, Dominic, from the city, from the art therapy, from the therapy studio or room. And I guess I'm evoking ecological theories where maybe the concept of nature itself is the problem, as in understanding it as such as something so separate. And I feel a lot of these practices have the potential, as it was said in the panel before, to bring nature within, right? Not something that it needs to be seeked out or something that needs necessarily an excursion to, I don't know, the countryside for 2 hours, but rather understanding, nature as something a lot more fluid, I guess. And I guess my question was, if there is anything in the practice that the speaker is talking about that can help this integration, particularly from a South African concept, undoing the separation between, because the minute we have nature, we need to dispose of stuff outside of nature, waste that was cited before. So I think it's really important to understand in this concept. Yeah, and also nature. Yeah, I had another thing, but I'll stop here. Thank you so much. Such an interesting panel.
Thank you, Ivan. So, Marlies, do you want to respond to that? There's a question about this this kind of construct we've got about nature being separate from human beings, and how do we have a relationship to nature? Ivan saying, well, actually, is that really a kind of dichotomy? Is that, so how can we address that through the work you do?
I'm thinking of an idea from many of the First Nations that I don't know, can't think of the right English word now. It's getting late here in South Africa, but it's about nature being named as personal. So she's not an object. So there's a quality of naming Mother Nature, or my brother the springbok that came with a message, and it's in the languaging that this shift in relationship gets created. So it's not an object that we use and do things to, but it's a personal relationship. It's with an entity. Yeah, that's just one idea that came to mind.
Sorry. No. Thank you so much. I love the idea of nature not as something to be defined or like an object, but as a relationship. I think actually that's exactly the answer that I was looking for, or that I didn't know I was looking for. So actually, I really, really like that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Diane, you have 5 minutes. Yeah.
I just wanted to add into that and respond to Ivan, because it links again with what we were mentioning earlier about anthropocentrism, that somehow we're separate from nature, and we're not. We are nature. Nature is within us. You know, we're made of carbon. We can't separate ourselves, but we have separated ourselves, and I think that's the struggle, is how we then challenge our own view about how we've become separate or allowed ourselves to become separate.
Yeah. And we can extend that in all sorts of directions. Like, there are more non-human cells in our body than there are human cells, which is kind of interesting sort of fact there. But so I think that, you know, that kind of relationship with nature is really complex. The kind of our microcosms, our gut-brain axis, all the kinds of different phenomena we interact with, but as well as, of course, with the wider world and how we interact with this too, whatever that means. But we've got about 5 minutes left. I'm just wondering if there are any more questions from the audience today. I mean, I just had a question, which is about what do you call yourself? You know, so if when you're meeting people, what do you call yourself? A therapist or a facilitator, or I mean, what do you call yourself? Yeah.
Definitely not a drama therapist. It scares people, and I think I'm not the only one who feels that way. I'm an arts therapist. Yeah.
So you tend to call yourself an artist.
And I don't think I wonder if we even introduce ourselves like that. I'm not sure. Just something that came up today that was interesting is this idea of the language that we use, and the concept of therapy and arts therapist, art psychotherapist, psychotherapies, psychosocial. It's not familiar. So and then you know, we are Spiel Collective, and that's often how we are introduced. And I like that.
Organization, your collective, your a kind of phenomena that extends beyond one person. Right? So
and I like the way that's evolved. Yeah.
Marlies, I can't resist popping back again to say, would you consider yourself a traditional healer?
Diane, you can't ask me that 2 minutes to go. No, I won't claim that. I think healer, but there's a very specific role in a community and a culture of a traditional healer, and I haven't done the training. So I dare not speak something that I haven't qualified for, you know.
What's been very interesting is that whilst you're so many miles away, I haven't counted how many, but in a very different kind of cultural context in lots of ways, there are lots of resonances between what you shared and what Diane and Katie shared. You know, in terms of change, in terms of being in this kind of environment and developing new relationships. but also this kind of, as Katie called it, a kind of wildness, right? This kind of acceptance, this kind of non-judgmental space. There's something about, yeah, I mean, as he put it, coming out. I love that.
And play.
Play, absolutely.
Yeah.
And, you know, so I think there seems to be, we seem to be finding similar spaces in very different cultural kind of contexts in some ways, with the very different heritages and different knowledges, but we seem to be sort of shaping something which has some kind of similar resonances, and I think it does seem to be something healing about it, and connected to traditional, right? It's sort of in this space. Diane, 28 years in clinical medicalized spaces, is saying, well, can we look beyond this at new stuff, right? And new ways of working, new ways of building dialogue, connections, and introducing different qualities of natural spaces, even within ourselves, as Ivan rightly pointed out. So this is, you know, I don't know if you have anything to say about that in terms of, you know, being in a very different kind of culture in some ways, and there's still being these kinds of connections. We've just got a couple of minutes left, or in fact in the last minute, so if we, I don't know if you felt that, or if you felt like it was just vastly different.
I just intuitively want to respond. It's as a Western trained therapist and someone who's holding a position of being a white South African woman born and bred in this country. There's all sorts of dynamics within that for me, and that, you know, it's set me on this path of being a therapist. But it's new to us. It's new. It's perhaps a new practice to us, but it's a very known practice into many spaces. And what perhaps is new is that it's spoken about as, you know, as an organized event or a workshop, but the work itself is very familiar to the people that we work with, and I am the one learning. Yeah.
Marlies, on that note, I think we're going to finish now. I just want to thank you so much for bringing this to us. It's been a real, like I said, just very wonderful to witness and be part of. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
The thing I want to add to that is, if you have produced an image, please do share it, because I think in a way we do want to build communities and connections and feel like there's something growing around this. And I think we've all had these kind of growing hands with our own sort of imprints of impressions, you know, so I'm hoping we can have this garden of hands on this virtual space somehow. So thank you for that. The other thing is, Jenny, do you want to say something about the seminars that are coming up?
I've just put it in the chat, so you can see it for yourself. But the next seminar is very music therapy focused. So please join us. It will be on the 16th of January. Same format. Will be, well, actually, we're going to be at Brunel, I think, isn't it, Dominic?
That's right, Brunel. That's right.
Yes. So join us in Brunel in person, or again online, and check the usual places you've been looking, where you know, Step Up for CNWL. Brunel also has a dedicated website, and we will write to everyone who was here and in the last one to let you know that it's coming up and when bookings are open. But please join us; it will be really interesting.
Yeah, that's right. So we have 4 amazing music orientated people, and some are working in digital spaces, music therapy, healing practices. So we're building a discourse between these musical spaces and what kind of impact this might have socially, particularly facing specific crisis type issues, let's say. So I think it'll be a really interesting kind of evening. Thank you. I know it's always a long session, but so worthwhile. So thank you for joining us on a Tuesday evening. And yeah, keep in touch. We'll keep in touch with you. Yeah, so that's the end of our evening. Thank you again to Senna, to Jenny, the audience here tonight.